fellow Toastmasters. I really do appreciate the opportunity to come up here and share some stories with you that are very meaningful and dear to me, important to me. I must warn anybody, one of the stories does contain some violence, so if you have a soft stomach, please be aware of that. My job over in Iraq was a psychological operations tactical team leader. And one of the things that I needed to do over there is know the culture, know the ins and outs of the people. And know, if you notice, when I meet people, I try and do the fist bump rather than shake with the left hand, because shaking with the left hand over there could get you killed. That was one of the big things that I learned. If you remember, in the beginning of the war, a lot of our helicopters were being shot down. A big part of the reason of that is because our troops would sit outside on the side of the helicopter with their feet hanging over the side. Well, the sole of your foot is a huge insult in the culture. If you remember, when President Bush was giving a speech, one of the Arabic men took his shoe off and threw him at President Bush. That's why. And you remember when they toppled Saddam Hussein's statue, a lot of the people were taking their shoes off and beating the statue with their shoe. That is why. So knowing the culture and the way things were is how it was. One of the villages I used to visit had 306 children under 18 years old. The village elder in this area, all 306 children were either his grandchildren or his great-grandchildren. Because in that culture, many men had multiple wives. He himself had 9 boys and 6 daughters. So all the children and grandchildren in that area were all his. So one village, one grandfather for all of them. I would go out and I would talk with people in the cities and introduce myself and what we're doing. And one of the areas I used to go to had an internet cafe, because back before we arrived, they didn't have the capability. They knew what they were told. But when we arrived, we built the satellite dishes and we provided more information. They had the capability of going online and researching things. But the owner of this internet cafe hated me, hated Americans. So when I went into this big cafe, or this big market area, he came out and started yelling at me, saying we came to there to steal the oil, we wanted all the money, we wanted to corrupt their children. So when the argument first started, when the discussion first started, he had about 30 people behind him. They were yelling at me and yelling at my team. And over time I said, well, tell me, before we arrived, now you have children, right? And he said, yes, I do. He goes, well, before I arrived, were your children going to school? Well, he said, no. I said, oh, you have daughters. Were girls capable of attending school? He's like, well, no. And then I said, okay, well, tell me, before we arrived, did cafes like yours exist? Well, he's like, no. I said, well, everything that we're corrupting and we're discarding that you're talking about, everything you have, it was provided because of our arrival. Because it was not uncommon for us to show up into the small villages out in the middle of nowhere. You might find a small mud hut. They might have one table and a carpet on the floor and one of those little refrigerators, but they had a satellite dish and a television to keep in, so they had the internet and the television so to keep track of things. I said, isn't this true? He's like, yes. Well, short of this long story is all those 30 people that were behind him yelling at me, by the end of the conversation, they were all behind me yelling at him, because he was telling us that we were there for the oil. I was like, well, do you realize for the United States to make the money back that we've spent coming here, we have to spend 14 cents a gallon for over 200 years? And he was like, okay. And so the crowd changed their view and started to understand things a little better. Across the street from the forward operating base that I was on was a small mosque, and next to this mosque was a small diner. And I was friends with the family. The gentleman, the father, the owner of the deli, he was kind of a neighborhood watch. It's the closest thing I can use. So when anything happened, he would call us, or he'd call the Iraqi police, the Iraqi army, and he let us know what's going on. One day I went over to his house, or outside his deli, and we were just having a conversation, and his son came home from school, and he's like, oh, Mr. Jerry, Mr. Jerry, Mr. Jerry. And he ran inside. I was like, okay. And a couple minutes later, after we're still having the conversation with the parents, his screen door kicked open. The son came running out, waving a piece of paper over his head, Mr. Jerry, Mr. Jerry. And he handed me this piece of paper. And on this piece of paper, he had a sailboat on it. You know, he had colored sailboat, and he had blue sky with the little birds drawn in the sky. And he was so happy. And he was telling me that they were learning about the ocean and the sea in school, and he was so excited about it. And I was like, oh, his name was Mahmoud. I was like, thank you so very much, Mahmoud. And I tried to give it back to him. He says, no, Mr. Jerry, I drew that for you. He said, because before you came, I couldn't go to school. My family is not wealthy. We weren't allowed to go to school. My sisters were not allowed in school. So I drew this picture for you because I wanted to thank you for giving us the opportunity. And I was very moved, of course. That day, the rest of the day was pretty quiet. Nothing major happened. So I went back to, I usually did about 3 to 6 hours of reports each day, but since my day was easy, no conflicts or anything like that, my day for reports was very short. So I did the reports, and all my team got together, and we used to play games like Risk. My team all got together, and we were playing a game of Risk that night. And it was about a little after 9 o'clock in the afternoon or evening, and we started hearing single gunshots, pop, pop. But this continued for a while, so it started to concern me because we lived right across the street from this area, and I knew the people in that area. So I went over to the operations center. I was like, you know what, my team, we know these people. We want to go out. We want to see what's going on. If you remember, I did have a bounty on my head. The bad guys didn't like me a lot, so they would not let me outside the gates at nighttime because I was a high-value target, and the battalion commander told me that if he lost me, that he would be in a lot of trouble. After these pops continued, suddenly there's a large amount of gunfire, and that was it. So the next morning, very first thing, I got my team together, and we went out across the street. Come to find out what had happened is the insurgents had gathered up each of the men of the neighborhood watch, all of their wives, some of them had 2 or 3 wives, and all of their children. What they had done, they made all the wives and children get on their hands and knees and watched as they beheaded each of the men of the neighborhood watch. Those single gunshots that we heard while we were playing Risk is after they beheaded these men, they put all the wives and all the children on their hands and knees and put 1 bullet in the back of the head for each of them. So young Mahmoud, who drew me that picture that day, unfortunately lost his life, as did his family and everybody else in the village. In total, there were 34 people that were killed that day. One of the most difficult things for me to overcome was the loss of my friends. I knew these people, these children, but I overcame it. And I started to understand, I love my country, and we are so lucky what we have here. And I appreciate the opportunity to live in this country and to share these types of stories for people to understand where we are today and how lucky we are to be in this country. And with that, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share these stories. And I have hundreds more we'll get to sometime. But thank you very much.